Good evening. Welcome once again to our Call to Conscience Black History Month series dedicated to telling stories in our voices and preserving the legacy of Black people, past, present, and future. We're so excited about once again celebrating Call to Conscience, and this month, again, we have a whole litany of things stored in store for you. We just, on Monday, we talked with Phil Armstrong from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and from Akuye Karen Vargas from Kitsap County, who shared with us preserving your legacy. And we shared with ways that you can preserve your legacy. You don't have to be a museum. You don't have to be a PhD. You just have to be able to say, I want to make sure that in my family, this is everybody, our legacy gets preserved. A number of ways we talked about that you can do that. You can do that with a photograph. You can do that with recording. You can do that just by saving keepsakes for your family to remember. It's all about preserving your legacy. If you don't preserve your legacy, someone else may get it wrong, and that's what we don't want to happen. And in particular, for Black history, that has been the case for a lot of years. As a matter of fact, this is the 100th anniversary of Black History Month. Well, it started in 1926 with Carter G. Woodson, and it was first called Negro History Week. And then in 1976, it became Black History Month. So this is pretty sensational that you have 50 years of Negro History Week and then 50 years of Black History Month, making this the 100th anniversary of Black History Month. We're excited to be here and share with you again a little bit. Now, Mr. Tharpe will be coming up, and he'll be talking with you about the Hartsfield Enslaved Quilt Collection. Tomorrow, we'll have a play here called Songs of the Forgotten that was written by a local playwright and actor, Arsalan Ibrahim. And then, starting on Saturday, the grand opening on Saturday morning, we'll be broadcasting live from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock. We have a number of special guest speakers who will be speaking, sharing some intimate stories about their journey and Black History Month, and also installations that they have here. And then at 11 o'clock, the museum's going to open up, and folks will be welcomed in for the next 2 weeks to look at installations and exhibits that share a little of the story of Seattle's African-American history. We're really looking forward to that. There'll be an exhibit here by the Seattle Black Panther Party. There'll be an exhibit here of Seattle icon Minnie Wilkins. There'll be an exhibit here of the late Dr. Quintard Taylor, who passed recently as well. Just a number of phenomenal exhibits here. The history of religion in Seattle. Yep, I'm not debating what you think about religion. We're just gonna share the facts with you. There'll be an exhibit here on the history of jazz in Seattle, which, if you're unaware of the history of jazz on Jackson Street, 20s, 30s, and 40s, Seattle was a major hub for jazz. As a matter of fact, this building that we're in right now, the Columbia City Theater, in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, this building was known as the Rainier Cinema. It was the only place that you could come to watch what we call Black and Kung Fu movies. And we will have authentic vintage movie posters here from that era. So we have a lot in store for you. Tonight's program is a powerful reminder that history doesn't only live in books and archives. It lives in our homes, in our hands, and sometimes stitched together, piece by piece. This evening, we're honored to focus on a collection that speaks quietly, but carries generations of truth, the Hartsfield Quilt Collection. These quilts are more than fabric. They're living documents crafted by enslaved ancestors whose creativity, resilience, and intelligence could not be erased. They tell stories of survival, coded communication, family, faith, and freedom. At a time when Black history was deliberately excluded or destroyed, our ancestors found ways to record their lives with needle and thread. We're honored tonight to be joined by someone who has dedicated himself to preserving this sacred history, Mr. Jim Tharpe. Mr. Tharpe has worked closely with the family of his to share and help bring this extraordinary collection to light, ensuring that these quilts are not only protected, but understood, respected, and passed forward to future generations. His work reminds us why Call to Conscience exists, because if we don't tell our stories, someone else will tell them for us, or worse, they won't even be told at all. So please join me in welcoming our guest lecturer for this evening, Mr. Jim Tharpe, as he shares the history and meaning and legacy of the Hartsfield Quilt Collection.
Thank you, Tony. This is a great privilege to stand here before you and discuss my family and what they've come through over the last 200 years. The quilts that you see here represent roughly that amount of time, going back to the early 1850s to the 1960s. You know, when Tony first asked me to present these quilts, he gave me a list of things that he wanted to make sure that I spoke to, and one of them was the role of these quilts and how did they affect my family. First of all, I like to say this type of quilting was not just from my family. All Black families, most Black families in the South made quilts. So in relationship to making these quilts, they always try to be better than their neighbor, especially when it came time to show their quilts. Now, an interesting point for me is that when I was a child and I would return to Tennessee to visit my grandparents, I would go to church and the children could not get into the church because the church was so filled with the people from, shall we say, all the other farms. And what the kids would do was play outside of the church. And that was our church, our time for fun. But one of the things that I will always remember is the fact that the women would come out after the sermon was over and they would lay out their quilts. And these quilts were just magnificent. They were beautiful. Now, to this day, I love art. And I can say at that point, I started to look at these quilts, as many others did, as art, and I enjoyed them. So over the years, as time passed, I enjoy saving or collecting anything and everything. And one of the things that came out is that my mother saw how I loved these quilts, and I loved the other antiques that we had. And this particular quilt, she said, I want you to have it. Now, what had happened was she was in Chicago, I'm in Seattle. I fly to Chicago, and my mother said, you know, your aunt is sick and she's in the hospital, but I have to pick up something. Would you go with me? So I said, no problem. We go to her home. She goes into one of the cabinets and she pulls out this particular piece. Now, it was not in the casing. I put that on later. But this particular piece. So she said, this is our hope quilt. And for years, for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been telling people, yeah, this is our hope quilt. And the reason why it was called hope quilt was because it was made in 1866 when blacks were freed in Texas. So what she did was see a pattern, which actually Tennessee Tennessee Museum said that this particular pattern that she looked at, that she made, was actually the Lincoln Hope Quilt for America. So this is the only slave interpretation of what the Hope Quilt was for America, made by a slave. So this is all information I'm just gathering up at this point. This piece is magnificent for that very point. There are no others like this. Now, I don't know how many people here are aware of how to make a quilt or what consists of a quilt. But when you look at this, you will see blocks Each block would take a person 9 stitches for every inch to create one of these blocks. So you can imagine the amount of time it took for this. Now, this particular quilt is interesting from the standpoint it does not have a backing. It was made, it was put together, but it was never put a backing. And it's called the Hope Quilt. And we'll get that into that a little bit farther. When my mother presented this particular quilt to me, she said, well, I want you to understand this is your hope quilt for a better life and that you'll get married one day and be happy. And so this was my second wife's gifts from my mother. So I said, okay, it's my hope quilt. I appreciate it. Anyway, from that standpoint, this quilt, again, is the finest of all. Now, the quilt over here, shall we say, 1 second. This particular quilt was the first quilt my great great grandmother made after slavery. And I shouldn't say after she was sold from her parents. She then was sold to a guy who was 13 years old. She was 13. They gave the parents of the boy was given my grandmother as a present. So they basically grew up together. And into 1900s, early 1900s, she was still working with him. So, but anyway, this was her quilt. Now, she was only 13, but the unique thing about this, 2 things I had to deal with. One was the fact was, okay, she's 13, she's put this together. As you can tell, it's fine work, craftsmanship in this. When I looked at it, then I had some other people look at it from the museum, and they started to say, well, blood stains, and So I can imagine my grandmother, my great great grandmother, leaving her parents. The only thing, her mother, the only thing that she had was this quilt. And the stains from this quilt, um, the only thing I can say when you look at it and it's a family member, you have to deal with the past. My history, what I grew up with, what my family's growing up with, this represents everything. Now, when she made this particular quilt, it wasn't until 16 years later she made this quilt. The only 2 quilts she saved during that period of time, even though I'm sure she made many more quilts. But these are the only 2 during that particular time. And then from there, let me move over. So the war was over. The Civil War had ended. Slaves were free. Black slaves were free a little bit later, and this is when this particular June, I call it the Juneteenth Hope Quilt. My grandmother was living through a period of time where every day she had an opportunity, or she she had an opportunity to see the worst of the worst during that time. So when you start talking about the Civil War is over, the army was in these towns, the Union Army was there protecting them. Things were changing, but it was still difficult to work. It was still difficult to get around. So all those things that a free person would have, They were free, but nothing was given to them. They just had to survive. So it was like 1 out of every 4 people died because of no care. Simple as that. So my grandmother looked at it and she started making Underground Railroad quilts. So I have a total collection of 14, but 12 are made during her time. And what she did, the only thing I've been putting together is that she did not believe she was free. In the event that they were not free, these quilts would save them to show them how to get out of the South. So all of her children were taught how to sew. All her children understood the patterns and what to do with them. The one on the very end is my grandmother, who, shall we say, died in 1975, and she created that quilt, and that quilt represents the Underground Railroad in every sense of the word. So between these three, we go from 1855, 66 to 1960. And my particular grandmother on the far end, she was the baby, the youngest of 22 children. So quilts passed through the generations, pardon me, to the children. In doing so, there was a caretaker, and I'm the last of the caretakers for the quilts. Each caretaker had a responsibility to pass on certain stories. Now, as a child, I was fortunate enough, like many others, that you were around your parents' friends, uh, in my case, parents and grandmother, um, people who had family who lived during slavery. And I had the opportunity to speak to those people and let them tell me stories, not just about their parents, but about what was happening in their town and how it's still related to the old South, deep, deep South. Even as a child, for example, when I went to town with my grandfather, we would go to the front door, and that's where they had the Confederate soldier there and all that kind of thing. And my grandfather would speak to the people, and then we would go to the rear of the building, and that's where all the blocks would come in, and totally different feel. So as a child, I got a chance to understand, there's this difference, and do understand you can get hurt if you do something differently. So throughout it all, understanding the South and going to the South and living and watching the people make these quilts, um, I just became a person who just loved them. And now I love showing them, taking them around and showing people, telling people about my family who, over 200 years, well, 175 plus years, have taken these quilts, saved these quilts, and told different stories to different generations to ensure that our family heritage will be passed on. So I'm thankful for that. Now, the other side of this coin, this is the one I want to take you to see. Now, remember, this is the block. And within the block, there is a message. Um, would one of you like to come up here? A little audience participation. Thank you. Now, what I want you to do, here's the block. Think about it's a graduation present, okay? Now, what do you see within that block?
I see a road trip, a driver's license, or
Mm-hmm.
Abe Lincoln, Pacific Ocean, um, a duck taking flight, moon, stars.
Good. You see stars here? You see the mallard ducks travel cross country? Here's the road map across country. Green means safe. Green means safe. Let me repeat that to make sure. Up here, you see the stars. You see the ducks that travel. You see the road map. The green represents, in uh, especially now slavery, it meant safe. Okay? So now, what you look at this block, you see the ducks. Now, keep in mind, I'm going away to college from high school. This is my quote for college. The ducks say I'm flying. Here's my road map. I'm in the sky. And the green that's all over the quilt means safe, which means go forth, son. You have your road map. And there it is. So it tells you when you look at it and you understand the principle, which is I'm going to college, I'm going out of town, and these are things that keep me safe when I'm at home. This is simplistic. She did this purposely for me so I could read it. But on the other hand, things like this, I'm not, I still don't know everything about them. And I have several other quilts. In fact, the world knows very little about them. It's just the fact that at this point, I have so many quilts, it's necessary for me to look at all of them as one collective body rather than individual, say, and get a real meaning for what my grandmother wanted to have happen. Yes, she was free. Slavery was over. But at the time, based on all the other things that was happening, Jim Crow alike, she didn't. She did not feel like she was totally free. So that's why I have all these quotes. It's unfortunate that many scholars don't believe that black folks had the intellect to put something like this together, to have a story being told. This is an obvious one because Abraham Lincoln had one similar, called it the Whole Quilt for America. The one over there that my grandmother made for me goes back in time as to read the signs so you understand what is happening. And by doing so, the green means safe. The ducks say travel the world. The stars say it's mine to have. And I'm grateful that she gave me a roadmap, not just for my life, but for right now. I appreciate that. Tony? So, what I would like to do is make sure. Um, one other thing about the green quilt, the 1960s quilt for safe, keep me safe. The color green is very important. Green is for safe. The people ask me how or why that my family saved these quilts and what message was passed down to ensure that these quilts would be saved and passed down to the next generation. Um, all I can say is that my grandmother told stories about her life to her family, and based on what I've said earlier, is the fact that my great 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 grandmother at 13 was sold to someone. Now, she had two children who obviously were mixed for that time, and she had other children, and she had to work things out between all the family with all the different relationships, shall we say. Even to the day, uh, I remember as a child, I was with my mother visiting one of her friends in the South, and I was looking at a field, and I said, "Mother, you know, that's a lot of work out there to be picking that cotton." And my mother looked at me and snatched me by my arm and said, "That wasn't the half of it. Rape was the issue. That destroyed the family. The cotton didn't." And it was based on my grandmother, what she had gone through, and the situations where in the family people were divided by color. That to the day she died, that was always in her mind. This is what caused would cause many problems. And considering she had problems with her own family that way, she had a brother who was dark, and half the girls were light, and that caused a lot of problems at their home. So my mother lived it, and not just my mother, a lot of other people lived it, and that's the thing. One of the last things that I remembered with my mother, and while she talked to me about this whole issue of race, and she said, "Well, it wasn't until the '80s that blacks could marry whites, and the reality would be that in the '50s, up to the '50s, you saw these light-skinned blacks basically representing rape of someone." So when as a child, I had that was one of the things that stuck in my head. It's like, okay, we're all, no matter what color we are, this is what we are. We are black people, and for that reason, my grandmother, my great great grandmother, kept this so that my family can say we're proud black people from America. So, any questions? Okay. Yeah. Two things I'm like this. I have to take care of. I have to do that for the remainder. That is the biggest challenge for me because this is nothing. A museum quality. This is almost $2,000 a piece, and that's definitely needed. But what can I say? Yes, I need to have. They will be put in some museum within the next year. I'm gonna get them out of here and go from there. Thank you, my friend. One of my great supporters.
All right, thank you, Mr. Tharpe. I just want to share a little information with you about quilting, in particular about black quilts. They are both an art form and a historical record, essentially stitched, like I said before, from survival, memory, resistance, creativity, and rooted in West and Central African textile traditions. Quilting traveled with enslaved Africans to the Americas, where it evolved under the brutal conditions of enslavement and later segregation, and what emerged was not simply utilitarian bed covers, but layered visual narratives that carried cultural knowledge, spiritual meaning, and community history. These traditions informed black quilting in the United States. Enslaved Africans repurposed scraps of cloth from plantation cast-offs. You have to also remember at this time there were no Michaels or Joann's to go to get material, so they had to find material wherever they could find it to make these quilts. And then the quilts, when they were being stitched together, this wasn't at a time of convenience. It was usually late at night with low light. So then again, when you take into consideration the precision in which these quilts were made, you also have to take into consideration the construct of the times that they were made as well. Color, rhythm, asymmetry, and improvisation, these are all hallmarks of African aesthetics, which distinguish black quilts from European quilting traditions. There were these things called quilting circles, and these gatherings preserved culture when literacy was often forbidden, and you heard Mr. Tharpe talk about that. Those quilting circles. Throughout slavery and into Reconstruction, Jim Crow quilts documented life experiences, births, deaths, marriages, migrations, faith, and significant events. And so often in these quilts, you'll find those particular things in the quilt patterns themselves. And during the Great Migration, these quilts traveled north with their families and carried ancestral memory into new geographics. And if you have not heard of the Quilt Codes, Mr. Tharpe briefly touched on this. Academia says they did not exist because they cannot find any written information about the Quilt Codes. This is really easy to debunk. If you were enslaved, and if you were sharing messages through quilting that you did not want your oppressor to know, if you could be killed for reading and writing, why would you write them down? Many of the traditions of African Americans and enslaved African Americans have been passed on orally, so this is not news to us. This is how we transfer information and have traditionally transferred information orally. And so what you see here in some of these patterns today are some of the things that let us know that these oral traditions are in fact true. Some of the traditional quilting patterns that you can identify, one is called the monkey wrench, which is, it says, prepare to escape, gather tools or supplies. The monkey wrench pattern, prepare to escape, gather tools or supplies. The bear's paw, which means follow animals' trails to find food and water. The log cabin, it had a black center. It was considered a safe house or a guidepost. Flying geese was the direction to travel, often north. Remember, these quilts were hung on clothing wires, and they were hung over at night. And then those who were running away from slavery would then find the quilts, and it was a very well-known thing that you could do these and you can get this information. So I just wanted to share a little more information with you about the quilts, a little more about black quilting. The drunkard path was create a zigzag route to avoid capture. And the North Star meant to follow the North Star to freedom. And so these are some of the things that are consistent that you'll find in whether the quilts come from Alabama or the quilts come from Tennessee or wherever the quilts came from. Some of these things are consistent. Obviously, when these oral traditions get passed on, some of the oral traditions may vary a little bit. But these are some consistencies to let you know that, yes, African Americans were savvy enough and were smart enough to figure out a way to communicate, to find freedom despite their oppressors. The quilt codes did exist. Black families and communities, however, the absence of written evidence does not equal the evidence of truth. Enslaved people relied heavily on oral communication, symbolism, and secrecy. The very nature of resistance required that these methods remain undocumented. Whether the quilts functioned as literal navigation tools or symbolic representations of resistance, their power lies in what they represent: Black ingenuity, covert resistance, and communal survival. So I just wanted to share a little more information with you about Black quilting and the quilt codes, and the fact that the Hartsfield family quilt collection includes quilts, again, that were made um, while folks were enslaved, and then those traditions carried on in the coding of those quilts as they pass those on from family members to family members. So even though you might find that in some of the quilts, depending on where they come from, there might be some of the differences in interpretation. That's a bit of what happens when information is passed on orally, because quilts that were made during slavery did not survive. They weren't making quilts as art. These quilts were used to carry things. These quilts were used to keep warm. These quilts were used to put out fires. That's why you can't find any today, because they weren't made just to hang up on the wall and show each other. And so what was passed on, so a quilt like this one and this one are very, very rare indeed to have a quilt that actually survived slavery. Most of what you'll find are quilts that were made following slavery, but passed on with the old traditions of what the quilt codes meant, and again, passed on with the traditions that these would mean. It could mean marriage, could mean birth. This was how enslaved African Americans communicated and shared their messaging while they were enslaved, despite the oppression of those who were enslaving them. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you all who are joining us literally from around the world to find out more about African American history. And we're delighted to have Mr. Tharpe here and share the Hartsfield quilt collection with us. It will be available at the museum. When the museum opens up on the 14th, you'll be able to come in and take a look at some of these quilts, and Mr. Tharpe might be here sometime to share some of his personal stories and family stories. So starting on the 14th at 10 o'clock, we'll have the grand opening. At 11 o'clock, the doors will be open. This building will be filled with artifacts, memorabilia, installations, and exhibits to share with African American history, which you don't have because you can't find it anywhere. And we're currently living in a time where history is under attack. And that's why I implore you to take the time to come down to Call to Conscience and get history from the folks who created the history, the folks whose history this is about, the folks who made the history. Because it's not just Black history, it's American history. And I'll say that again. It's not just Black history, it's American history. Now think about when this country got started, but African American history did not become something that even became significantly relevant to this country until 1926, when Carter G. Woodson created Negro History Week, because there was no information about our history. And I'm telling you today, if you go down to King County Archives to find out about African Americans who were in this city in the 1800s and the 1900s, we don't exist. There is no information on us. I was curious about something when I went down to the archives. I said, okay, well, there was this thing called the Great Depression. During the Great Depression in this city, jobs were given to folks. Money was given to folks to help them survive. And they have records that show who was given money, who was given jobs to help decide to help survive the Great Depression. No African Americans are listed, which makes you wonder, once again, how did we survive? What ingenuity, what brilliance did we have that is not recorded, that we will never know?
So thank you again for coming. And for everyone, it's important to preserve your legacy because history starts now. Today is history. So I recommend that each of you talk to your elders while they're still here, even though sometimes I know it can feel like, I don't want to hear these old stories anymore. Record them. We have these phones now where you can record information and record these stories because 50 years from now, things will have changed. And your family history is something that is your responsibility to keep track of. And we encourage you to do that. We have the tools to do that now. We have the internet. We have all these different things where you can keep information and store information. A lot of times things were stored through artifacts that were kept in attics or treasure chests or basements. And yes, the worst things happened. They were flooded. That information is lost and gone forever. And then even in some instances, the grandchildren and great grandchildren who had all this stuff said, well, what are we going to do with this? There's nowhere to put it. There's nowhere to take it. And more often than not, it was thrown away. That's what has happened to Black American history because there wasn't the effort put into preserving it, writing it, archiving it, and keeping it. That's why we do this today. That's why there is a call to conscience. That's why these events like the Hartsfield Enslaved Quilt Collection are so important because you get the opportunity to hear information and have information shared with you about history. This is the truth. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening from all around the world. We'll be back tomorrow with the Songs for the Forgotten, which is by an original work play by Arsalan Ibrahim. He is a local playwright and actor. And then again, we'll be here for 2 weeks starting on Saturday with the museum open where you can see exhibits and installations and artifacts as well. I will remind you that on September 21st, Elmer Dixon, who is he was one of the founders of the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party, will be here and he'll be signing books and sharing stories. And if you don't know, the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party was the first chapter of the Black Panther Party formed outside of the state of California. And they did some incredible things. You may have heard about this thing called the Free Breakfast Program. Did not exist. This national institution called the Free Breakfast Program was started in Seattle by the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party, who understood that if we don't nourish our children and our youth, they will not be prepared to learn. That started in Seattle by the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party. They also started a free clinic, which still survives today. The Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party was also involved in a national movement to get folks tested for sickle cell. Sickle cell is a disease that primarily affects African Americans, and there weren't tests going on, and people didn't know. The Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party took that on as one of their initiatives, along with other members of the chapters of the Black Panther Party, and throughout the United States, made sure that folks got tested for sickle cell. So there are a lot of different areas. We'll have an exhibit here that shows, again, like I said before, the impact that Seattle had on jazz in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. If you were anybody anywhere, you came to Seattle, this very stage that we are on right now. Some of the likes who performed on here include Jimi Hendrix, Quincy Jones, Ray Charles, Duke Ellington, Sarah Vaughan, Fats Waller. I could go on and on and on, but this isn't information that you'll find anywhere. But you're getting it here today, and we'll have it here for you for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll archive it, and then we're partnering with the Seattle Griot Project and some other institutions. There is blackpast.org. There's an institution here for an installation here for Dr. Quintard Taylor, who started blackpast.org, which has over 85 million views. It is the foremost website that you could find to find information on the contributions of African Americans to not only this country, but African Americans worldwide and the contributions that they made in their countries. So you're going to get a ton of information here. And the reason why I'm being redundant about it is because this, unfortunately, is one of the only places where you're going to find this information, and we're only going to be here until the end of February. So I implore you to continue to view us on RainerAvenueRadio.world. We're also being viewed on all of our social media across the world. So YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook. There'll be more opportunities to view this information. And then once it is recorded, it will be archived and you can go back on demand and you can watch it again. So we're really happy about that. And we've recorded these call to consciousness in a number of different ways. I've done them in 3D. We've done them in ways where you can actually put on goggles and participate and then take a tour of previous call to conscious events. And if you like a tour guide, you can ask for a tour guide. The tour guide will join you, and then you can take the tour with the tour guide virtually. So we're using technology to ensure that our history is here. A little bit more about what we were doing. Thank you for indulging me. My name's Tony B. for Rainier Avenue Radio, for Jim Tharpe and the Hartsfield Quilt Collection, and for everyone who's been involved in helping us put together. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming.